What's up guys, this video is all about how to work with lists in Python. Let's get on with it. Let's start by creating a basic list. So we'll have a variable called a list. Lists are enclosed in square brackets, and inside the brackets we need to comma separate the values that we want to store. So let's have the name John, followed by surname Smith, followed by age 14, followed by maybe a test score, 89. Now let's look at how you can access the items within that list. Now if you've watched my strings video, you'll know how indexing works, and it works in just the same way for a list. So let's say that I wanted to access the first item in the list. So what I do is put the variable, a list, and then in square brackets, I put the index or position of the item that I'm looking for. And indexes start at 0, so John is in position 0. Let's do something with that. So let's go ahead and print it and run it. And there we go, it prints out the first item in the list. If I change that to a 1, it will be the next item in the list, which is Smith. 2 and 3. Worth noting that if you want to simply access the last item in the list, you can use -1. That means count from the end of the list. So that will also print 89, or -2. Remember, it's counting from the back, so that's going to be the 14. Using this negative method is particularly useful if you don't know how long your list is. So if you have a program that's adding or deleting things from a list, you can use this minus technique to always access the last item. Now, what if you want to know the index of an item within a list? Let's say I want to know what position in the list Smith is at. Well, what we can do is use the name of the variable, a list, and then we can say dot index, and then in the brackets, the thing we're looking for. So I want to know the index of Smith. I need to do something with that information. Let's go ahead and print all of that. So I want to print out the index of Smith within the variable, a list. And it tells me that Smith is at index 1. Remember, starting at 0, so 0, 1. Now let's have a look at how we go about doing two things that you often need to do with lists: delete an item and add an item. Let's work with the same list. Let's start by looking at how to delete an item from the list. So let's say I want to get rid of Smith. Now the way that I would do that is by putting the name of the variable, dot, and then the method that we're going to use is called pop. The pop method works by deleting the item at a given index. So for example, if I was to put a 1 in here, remember John is at index 0 and Smith is at index 1. Now let's go ahead and print the list so that we can confirm that Smith has been removed. There we go, simple as that. Another way that you can delete an item from a list is to use .remove. This works in a slightly different way. Instead of putting the index or position of the item you want to delete, you put the value that you want to delete. So for example, I could put 14 in here. It is worth pointing out that if your list has got more than one of this value in it, so let's say that there was a 14 later on in the list, .remove would only remove the first one. Now let's run this again. There we go. Finally, let's have a look at adding a value to the list. So to do that, there's the name of the variable, dot append. Now the append method will simply put the value on the end of the list. Let's go ahead and append a Boolean value, true. So we'll run this again, and now it should have John 89, true. Now let's talk about two-dimensional lists. So a two-dimensional list is basically a list of lists. Let me show you what I mean. So this time, I've created my list in the same way that I did before with my square brackets, but now I'm going to create a list made of lists. So the first item in this variable, a 2D list, is all of that, a list. Let's put a comma. The next item in the list is another list, comma. Then you guessed it, another list, and let's go for one more. There we go. We now have a two-dimensional list. We have a list that contains 4 lists. Now this might seem complicated at first, but let's try and clear things up. Let me show you a better way to format a two-dimensional list in a way that hopefully makes it clearer and easier to understand. So we're back here. I've created a variable with an empty list. Let's go ahead and create a two-dimensional list, but hopefully in a way that is clearer. So this time what I'm going to do, before I start putting in my lists, I'm going to hit return and actually open this list up. So now I'm on a separate line. There's my first list within my two-dimensional list, comma, return onto the next line. There's the next one, comma, onto the next line. List number 3, comma, and the final list. Remember, no comma at the end, because that's the last item in the list. Formatting a 2D list in this way makes it much easier to work with. I can now clearly see the 4 separate lists that are within my two-dimensional list. I could even clear this up a little more by introducing some spaces just to help to line up all of these values. And now you can see how they all line up. It almost looks like a table with rows and columns. Now let's look at how you can access items within a 2D list. So we're going to do this using indexing, just like we did before. Let me show you what I mean. Let's put the name of the variable, a 2D list, square brackets. Now in here, if I put 0, that means first item in a 2D list. Now the first item is all of that. That list is the first item in a 2D list. Let's check that that is the case. Let's go ahead and print item 0 in a 2D list, and you'll see that it prints out that whole list. After those 2 square brackets, I can now put the index of the item I'm looking for within this list. So let's say that I wanted 14. That's going to be 0, 1, 2. So another set of square brackets, 2. So that now means access the first item within a 2D list, which is that list, and then from that list access item at index 2, 0, 1, 2. So this should print out 14. Now if you have your 2D list formatted the way that I do here on separate lines, you can actually think of these square brackets as rows and columns. So in effect, let's say that I want row 3, which is this one, and column 1, which is this one. I can say first set of brackets, index 2, 0, 1, 2, and then for the column, I want the first column, so that's 0. Run it, and it should say David. So hopefully thinking of these square brackets as rows and columns in a two-dimensional list will make them easier to work with. Now it's time to really step things up a gear. Let's delete all of that, and I'm going to replace it with a similar list, but I've made a few little tweaks to it. So the square bracket at the beginning and the end, that's our main list, student data. The items within student data are all lists. So each of these 4 lists is an item within student data. But then if we look within one of these lists, we can see we have John, Baker, 14, and then another list. A list inside a list inside a list. This is now a 3-dimensional list. And what we're going to do is have a look at how we can loop through this data and actually do some interesting stuff with it. This is going to get quite complex, so hopefully it will make sense. So let's get started. I'm going to begin by creating a for loop that just says for every student in student data. So remember, in this case, student is going to be each of these lists. And I'm going to confirm that by just printing student. There you go, it prints out the 4 lists that are within student data. Let's delete the print statement. I'm going to create some variables and just extract information from each of those 4 student lists. So I know that the first name is going to be student 0. So remember, in our for loop, that is student. So John would be student 0, Baker would be student 1, the age would be student 2, and the list of scores would be student 3. So let's store each of those in its own variable. Last name is going to be student 1. Age will be student 2. And finally, their scores will be student 3. Let's just check that's worked. So for example, let's say I want to print the scores for all students. You can see that I've managed to loop through the list and print out all of the scores. Let's carry on. I'm going to calculate the average score for each student as well. To calculate an average, of course, I need to add up the 3 scores and divide it by the number of scores. So I can do that quite simply by using the inbuilt sum function. So if I put the list of scores into sum, that sum function will just add up all those scores for me. And I'm going to divide that by how many scores there are. So that's going to calculate the average. Let's go ahead and print that. So those are the average scores for those 4 students. Now let's go ahead and print some useful output for the user. To output my sentence here, I'm going to use a formatted string literal. There's a mouthful. Shorten it to F string. It sounds more complicated than it is. So to create an F string, you do an F followed by 2 quotes. And then basically, inside the quotes, you start writing the sentence that you want. So I'm going to put test scores for, and I want to put the first name here. So what I do is use a brace like that. When I run this, the program will actually replace those braces with the first name. So test scores for first name, last name, and I'm going to put their age in brackets here. Aged, age, and then a colon. Let me just expand this so that's all on one line. So it's going to print a sentence that looks like, for example, test scores for John Baker, aged 14, colon. Remember, we're inside a for loop here, so this happens for all 4 students. I'm now going to print out the scores as a numbered list. Stay with me. So to do that, for I in range, create a for loop. I need this to loop through all 3 scores in that little scores list. So I could put 3, but maybe at a later date, more scores will be added. So let's measure the length of scores. So this for loop is now looping through all of those. And then all of those, and then all of those. So I'm going to use that same F string technique. F and 2 quotes. And to create my numbered list, I'm first of all going to have I plus 1. Remember, I is a counting variable that starts at 0. So by putting plus 1, it's going to start at 1 instead. And then a bracket. So that's the numbered part of my numbered list. And then after that, I'm going to put scores I. Let's go ahead and run that and see what it does. We can see that the for loop has looped through all 4 students in student data, producing a sentence for each one with their age, and for each one, then outputting a numbered list of their scores. It's looking pretty complex. Let's also output the average. So again, creating an F string, and I'm going to say average, colon, and then in braces, insert the average variable there. Run it again, and now the program also outputs the average score for each student. I don't like the fact that we've got all those decimal places going on, so up here, where I'm calculating the average, I'm going to put all of that inside the round function, so that those scores are rounded. And finally, let's just add a nice gap in between the 4 printouts. That's easily done by adding a blank print statement. And there we go. We are now looping through that 3-dimensional list using not 1 for loop, but 2 for loops, printing out that data in a way that is nice and accessible to the user of the program. Now let's go one step further. Instead of just printing this out for all the data in student data, maybe we actually ask the user to enter a first name and last name so that they can look this up. So I'm going to create a variable to store the first name that is inputted by the user. Let's give them a message. Enter first name. Let's make a variable to store the last name entered by the user. So now the user can enter the first name and the last name of the student they're looking up. And now inside the for loop, instead of automatically doing this for all 4 students, what I'm going to do, after storing the first name and the last name from the student data list, I'm now going to say if the first name entered by the user is equal to the first name from the list, and the last name entered by the user is equal to the last name from the list, all of this indent it inside. So now the program is only going to bother storing age and scores and working out the average, and then printing out all of this, if the name entered by the user is found. Let's run it. Enter first name. So if I type in a name that isn't there, there is no Glenn Davis. It didn't do anything. Run it again. Let's try typing in Emma and Harris. Test scores for Emma Harris, aged 15, 78, 87, 90, average 85. Now don't worry if you didn't manage to stick with me through all of that, but I just wanted to give you a more complex example to show you the sorts of things that you can do when you're working with 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional lists. And there you go. That's how you work with lists in Python. See you next time.